Hey guys, Lord Naren White here, the Holy Ghost, the one true God. Back with you with the next video in my series reading The Adventures of Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain. Without further ado, returning to The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, as read by Lord Naren White. This superintendent was a slim creature of 35, with a sandy goatee and short, sandy hair. He wore a stiff, standing collar, whose upper edge almost reached his ears, and whose sharp points curved forward abreast the corners of his mouth. A fence that compelled a straight look out ahead, and a turning of the whole body when a side view was required. His chin was propped on a spreading cravat, which was as broad and as long as a banknote, and had fringed ends. His boot toes were turned sharply up, in the fashion of the day, like sleigh runners, an effect patiently and laboriously produced by the young men sitting with their toes pressed against a wall for hours together. Mr. Walters was very earnest of mind, and very sincere and honest at heart, and he held sacred things and places in such reverence, and so separated them from worldly matters, that unconsciously to himself his Sunday school voice had acquired a peculiar intonation, which was wholly absent on weekdays. He began after this fashion. Now, children, I want you all to sit up just as straight and pretty as you can, and give me all your attention for a minute or two. There, that is it. That is the way good little boys and girls should do. I see one little girl who is looking out the window. Out of the window. I am afraid she thinks I am out there somewhere, and perhaps up in one of the trees making a speech to the little birds. Applausive titter. I want to tell you how good it makes me feel to see so many bright, clean little faces assembled in a place like this and learning to do good, to do right and be good. And so forth and so on. It is not necessary to set down the rest of the oration. It was of a pattern which does not vary, and so is familiar to us all. The latter third of the speech was marred by the resumption of fights and other recreations among certain of the bad boys, and by fidgetings and whisperings that extended far and wide, washing even now to the bases of isolated and incorruptible rocks like Sid and Mary. But now every sound ceased suddenly, with the subsidence of Mr. Walter's voice, and the conclusion of the speech was received with a burst of silent gratitude. A good part of the whispering had been occasioned by an event which was more or less rare, the entrance of visitors, Lawyer Thatcher, accompanied by a very feeble and aged man, a fine, portly, middle-aged gentleman with iron-gray hair, and a dignified lady, who was doubtless the latter's wife. The lady was leading a child. Tom had been restless and full of chafings and repinings, conscience smitten too. He could not meet Amy Lawrence's eye. He could not brook her loving gaze. But when he saw this small newcomer's soul was his the, when he saw this small newcomer, his soul was all ablaze with bliss in a moment. The next moment he was showing off with all his might, cuffing boys, pulling hair, making faces, in a word, using every art that seemed likely to fascinate a girl and win her applause. His exultation had but one alloy, the memory of his humiliation in the angel's garden, and that record in sand was washing out under the waves of happiness that were sweeping over it now. The visitors were given the highest seat of honor, and as soon as Mr. Walter's speech was finished, he introduced them to the school. The middle-aged man turned out to be a prodigious personage, no less than than the county judge, altogether the most august creation these little children ever looked upon. And they wondered what kind of material he was made of, and they wanted to hear him roar, and were half afraid he might too. He was from Constantinople, 12 miles away, so he had traveled and seen the world. And these very eyes had looked upon the county courthouse, which was said to have a tin roof. The awe which these reflections inspired was attested by the impressive silence and the ranks of staring eyes. This was the great Judge Thatcher, brother of their own lawyer. Jeff Thatcher immediately went forward to be familiar with the great man and be envied by the school. It would have been music to his soul to hear the whisperings. "Look at him, Jim. He's a going up there. Say, look. He's a going to shake hands with him. He is shaking hands with him. By jings, don't you wish you was, Jeff?" Mr. Walters fell to showing off with all sorts of official bustlings and activities, giving orders, delivering judgments, discharging directions here, there, everywhere that he could find a target. The librarian showed off, running hither and thither with his arms full of books, and making a deal of the splutter and fuss that insect authority delights in. The young lady teachers showed off, bending sweetly over pupils that were lately being boxed, lifting pretty warming fingers at bad little boys and patting good ones lovingly. The young gentlemen teachers showed off with small scoldings and other displays of authority and fine attention to discipline, and most of the teachers of both sexes found business up at the library by the pulpit, and with it was the business that frequently had to be done over again 2 or 3 times, with seeming much vexation. The little girls showed off in various ways, and the little boys showed off with such diligence that the air was thick with paper wads and the murmur of scufflings. And above it all the great man sat, and beamed a majestic judicial smile upon all the house, and warmed himself in the sun of his own grandeur, for he was showing off too. There was only one thing wanting to make Mr. Walter's ecstasy complete, and that was a chance to deliver a Bible prize and exhibit a prodigy. Several pupils had a few yellow tickets, but none had enough. He had been around the star pupils inquiring. He would have given worlds now to have that German lad back again with a sound mind. And now, at this moment, when hope was dead, Tom Sawyer came forward with 9 yellow tickets, 9 red tickets, and 10 blue ones, and demanded a Bible. This was a thunderbolt out of a clear sky. Walters was not expecting an application from this source for the next 10 years, but there was no getting around it. Here were the certified checks, and they were good for their face. Tom had therefore elevated to a place with the judge and the other elect, and the great news was announced from headquarters. It was the most stunning surprise of the decade, and so profound was the sensation that it lifted the new hero up to the judicial one's altitude. And the school had 2 marvels to gaze upon in place of one. The boys were all eaten up with envy, but those that suffered the bitterest pangs were those who perceived too late that they themselves had contributed this hated splendor by trading tickets to Tom for the wealth he had amassed in selling whitewashing privileges. These despised themselves, and being as the dupes of a wily fraud, a guileful snake in the grass. The prize was delivered to Tom with as much effusion as the superintendent could pump under the circumstances, but it lacked somewhat of the true gush of the poor fellow's instinct, taught him that there was a mystery here that could not well bear the light. Perhaps it was simply preposterous that this boy had warehoused 2,000 sheaves of scriptural wisdom on his premises. A dozen would strain his capacity, without a doubt. We'll go ahead and stop there for this week. As usual, I want to say thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Please like, comment, and subscribe, as it greatly helps the channel. Light be with you all. Take care. And thanks again.